"Hey, it's the end of your shift. I got it from here," a man told one of the lookouts. The young lookout smiled at the man, yet said nothing as he walked in the direction from where this person had come from. It was the direction of the sleeping quarters. It was around 2 a.m., and everyone but Jimmy was asleep. Jimmy was 6'2", had recently turned 37, and was a very experienced outdoorsman. He was wearing a long-sleeved flannel shirt and blue jeans. He also wore a leather belt as well as a baseball cap he usually had on backward. He had recently agreed to go on a trip with some friends to go hunting on a remote island that was said to hold exotic animals. Exotic animals that were slowly going into extinction. Jimmy didn't see it as poaching. Instead, he saw it as preserving the memory of these creatures. Jim leaned his arms over the front railing of the large sailboat, looking out into the dark abyss. The only thing he could hear was the gentle waves crashing against the sides of the vessel. It was both calming yet also sent shivers down his spine. Not because there was a light, cool breeze, but because the idea of being stranded out here with no light source was horrifying to him. However, he couldn't help but image he was isolated in the middle of the ocean, with no sense of direction, no people, and no land. Just hundreds of miles of the sea. Luckily, an oil lantern was situated by his feet, giving the man some comfort. The oil probably hadn't been changed in a while because very dim light was being produced, but it got the job done. As Jim continued to look into the pitch-black void, barely being able to see 20 feet in front of him, he began to recall why there had to be a lookout. Since they were driving their boat through restricted waters, a lookout had to be placed at the nose of the boat to alert the crew if any authorities caught them. Jimmy looked up in the sky, trying to look for the moon behind the dark gray clouds, thinking it was ridiculous that any authorities would be hundreds of miles off the coast of Costa Rica, but it was better to be safe than sorry. Jimmy closed his eyes, lowering his head to face the open ocean, letting the breeze glide across his face. He remembered the conversation he had back in San Diego with his wife, Mary Ann. When he brought up the upcoming trip, there was some uncertainty among the two. Mary Ann had let Jim go on these hunting trips before, but there was something different about this trip. She had told him one night that she had a bad feeling, and that he should cancel. Jim assured her that it was completely safe, and that it was just her nervous nature that was making her anxious. He told her that he would be back in around a week or so, and that he would take every safety precaution there was. Suddenly, something heavy hit the right side of the boat, shaking the entire vessel. Jim broke out of this little trance, startling him. He waited 1 second to process what just happened, and then leaned down to pick up the oil lantern. He sighed, grabbed the thin handle, and raised it to eye level. He walked over toward where he thought he heard the impact. Great, this is the last thing we need. The boat running into something, Jimmy thought to himself. As he arrived on the side of the boat, he grew hesitant to look over the edge at first, but he eventually extended the lantern over the rail, holding onto the handle tight. Peering over the edge, he could not see anything, other than the reflection of the light bouncing off the water. He brought the lantern closer to the side of the boat, hoping that would make a difference. Luckily for him, it did, and it seemed nothing was damaged. Jimmy sighed in relief, glad that the boat wasn't injured. "Must have been a log," Jimmy whispered to himself. He took a few more seconds to examine it a little more, but the only thing he could note was the soft waves crashing against the sides of the sailboat. Jimmy retracted his hand back over the railing, onto his side, still holding it at eye level. He looked back up again into the sky, and without realizing it, the dark gray clouds had moved enough to reveal the giant white glowing surface of the moon. The moon had given enough illumination to where he could now see a decently fair way out into the distance. Not much, but it was certainly better than the eternal darkness that had surrounded him previously. Something suddenly gripped Jimmy's shoulder. His eyes widened while his heart skipped a beat. Jim turned his entire body, quickly spinning around so he could look at whoever was behind him. Whoa, easy Jim, it's just me," the person said, trying to relax Jim. Once Jim was face to face with this person, he let out a sigh of relief, his heart rate returning to normal. It was one of his closest friends, Joshua. Joshua was one of the newest members to join the hunting party. He was 35 years old and enjoyed exploring the world. They became quick friends after Joshua's first hunting trip around a year ago in Africa. During that trip, it was discovered that the two men had much in common. "I hope I didn't scare you," Joshua said, giving a light chuckle. "Oh, of course not. It's just nerve-wracking when you're the only person out here," Jim said, wiping his brow. Jim walked back over to the front of the boat where he originally was. Joshua followed close behind him. "Why are you out here?" Jim asked as he arrived back at the front railing, laying his arms over it once again. "Well," Joshua sighed, looking out into the open ocean as he stood beside his friend, his hands placed on the rail. "I felt something shake the boat earlier and it woke me up. After that I couldn't sleep. I checked my watch and realized that it was your shift to be on lookout, so I decided to visit you. Silence overtook the conversation. The two men looked towards the ocean, watching the moonlight reflect off the water. Joshua dressed a lot like Jim. The only difference is that Joshua likes to wear t-shirts instead of long-sleeve shirts. He also sported a nice watch that was gifted by his father. The watch had a brown leather wrist strap, whereas the watch itself was a nice clean silver color. The clouds began to cover the moon once again, turning the glistening water into pure black waves. Jim turned his attention to Joshua, who was still looking at the water, and continued their conversation. I investigated that tremor you were talking about, but I didn't seem to find. Suddenly, something heavy smashed into the left side of the vessel. This time, much harder. It nearly sent Jim over the rail. Luckily, Joshua grabbed onto him just in time. In a panicked state, Jim grabbed the oil lantern, which was now lying on its side, and rushed toward the impact. Joshua was not far behind him. Yet they couldn't even make it to that side before yet another impact shook the boat like crazy, this time on the opposite side. This caused the two men to crash onto the ground, one on top of the other, with the oil lantern slipping from Jim's grasp. Regaining their focus, Jim and Joshua started looking around, realizing that it was now pitch black. The oil lantern was gone. They both stood up, changing their main priority to find the only light source they had. "Where is it?" Joshua yelled out, not just to Jim, but also to himself. Jim was on his hands and knees, practically blind, trying to see if he could bump into it. "I can't find it," Jim exclaimed, as his body began to shiver. The wind had drastically changed to a howling beast, and the ocean turned more intense as larger waves crashed against the sides. This was turning into a nightmare. "It must have rolled into the ocean," Joshua yelled to Jim. Jim could barely see Joshua, only knowing where he stood from the sound of his voice. It then began to slowly rain, with a few water droplets splashing against Jim's body. "Of course it's raining now. Of course," Jim thought to himself sarcastically. Now the water was becoming more violent than ever. Massive waves crashed up the sides of the boat, with sometimes water splashing onto the deck. "Go check with the crew. See what's taking them so long," Jim yelled out to Joshua. He heard a faint okay in the distance, but wasn't sure. The wind was blocking most of his hearing. Jim stood up and began walking towards where he thought was the direction of the sleeping quarters. The rain was picking up pace, and the wind grew colder by the minute. Jim couldn't take much more of this. He was cold and tired, but mostly terrified. He hadn't heard anything from Joshua in a while, which either meant he was checking up on the crew, or something happened to him. He flailed his arms, seeing if they would come into contact with something. His hands then touched something cold and cylindrical. It was the front railing of the boat. He went the wrong way. Before turning round, out in the distance, he heard a loud growl sound, coming from the water. He spun to face where he thought he heard this odd sound until yet another impact occurred, this time hitting the back of the boat, lurching it forward. This caused Jim to slip and fall onto his back, hitting his head on the hard floor. A daze started to brew as he lay motionless on the floor. He was looking up into the night sky as rain pellets battered against his face and body relentlessly. He felt tired, thinking if he just slept, then this would all go away. His blinking started to slow down, as did his breathing. Growing more and more tired as the seconds passed, he began to wonder many things. Where did the lantern go? What's taking the crew so long? Did Joshua hear me? Is Joshua trying to figure out why the crew was taking so long? What's in the water? Why was this happening? Until he finally closed his eyes.